The Gracchi brothers, Cicero, and Julius Caesar. Tiberius Gracchus, the Roman New Deal. It is an ironic but outstanding lesson of history that the Roman constitution of the middle of the 2nd century BCE, respectively, whose stability and permanence seemed so apparent to Polybius, was soon to weaken and collapse. Polybius's verdict on the history of the Greek states that while they still thought themselves prosperous and likely to remain so, they found themselves involved in circumstances that were completely the reverse. And it applies equally well to the last century of the Roman Republic from 133 to 31 BCE. And I make a reference here from Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Tiberius Gracchus. The 100 years preceding 31 BCE witnessed extremely great changes not only in Rome's political institutions, but in every other important aspect of Roman civilization. And so modern historians have aptly named the period the Roman Revolution. For at its end, Cicero could sadly contemplate the radical changes it had brought and ask, quote, what remains of the old ways in which Ennius, from 239 to 169 BCE, whose poetry celebrated the old traditions, said the Roman state stood rooted. The forces that destroyed the old ways came out of the new environment produced by Rome's expansion in the Mediterranean area. The political, economic, social, and cultural ideas, as well as the institutions which had served well a small city-state, underwent radical change when Rome emerged as a world power during this time. The impact of the new forces that were destined to change Roman civilization was manifested in politics for the first time during the tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus in 133 BCE. Tiberius was a young aristocrat in whom the influence of the liberal learning of Greece, newly imported and popular in the best educated circles of Roman higher society, combined with an awareness that the old Roman way of life was fast slipping away, and inspired him to become a reformer. He proposed an agrarian reform law aimed at solving all the problems that had arisen out of the new environment created by Rome's expansion. Again, there was a land problem, and Tiberius had a land law. He also had a veto and impeachment of Octavius as well. He also wrote about the Senate's control of foreign policy, as well as his justification of the impeachment of Octavius as well. But regarding the expansion of the Roman state, he tried to solve these problems by creating the new land law. He hoped to recapture the traditional Roman ways by restoring the old environment that had originally produced them, and by breaking up the newly formed large estates worked by a slave labor force plentifully provided by Rome's wars. He would then reverse the trend of events that had brought troubles to the Roman state. The dangerous and still growing proletariat of the city would be dispersed to become again a middle class of small landowners. The old Roman morale and traditional values would reappear. A citizen army of sturdy men would be possible as of old, and a stable foundation for democratic government would be provided. And in his hopes for these beneficial results of land reform, Tiberius Gracchus reflected a traditional Roman viewpoint. A generation earlier, Marcus Cato the Elder had written of the old Romans that when they praised a man as good, they called him a good farmer and a good tiller of the soil. And he had insisted that from among the tillers of the soil, both the strongest men and the most efficient soldiers come, and that way of gaining a livelihood carries with it beyond all others fidelity to gods and men, and stability and freedom from envy, and those occupied in it are less liable to evil thoughts. The opposition to Tiberius's agrarian law centered in the Senate, not only because its members constituted the great landowning class whose economic interests were threatened, but above all because the political supremacy of that body was challenged by the tactics used by the reformer. Since the passage of the Hortensian Law in 287 BCE, Rome had become a democracy with an unwritten constitution of checks and balances, which had aroused the admiration of Polybius. But Polybius had failed to notice that in the unsettled period following the passage of the Hortensian Law, Rome had in fact remained an oligarchy in which the senatorial nobility continued to rule, and during these critical years, Rome had fought the Punic Wars and had expanded in Italy and the Mediterranean, and the Roman populace willingly allowed the Senate, composed largely of experienced former magistrates, to take over all the administrative power and legislative authority of the state. And then when Tiberius Gracchus revived the democratic power of the popular assembly in order to bypass his opposition in the Senate, the supremacy of the senatorial oligarchy was threatened. And then that, of course, is why the Senate resorted to force. But in the ensuing struggle, it is difficult to determine the degree of guilt or innocence of the rival factions, for both resorted to illegal or ill-considered measures, but certainly the use of violence by the senatorial faction was the great error that ultimately reaped the whirlwind of civil war and led to the fall of the Roman Republic. Yet the lesson found here has rarely been learned, and history is filled with similar instances and patterns in which men blinded by fear and hate have unwittingly destroyed that which they sought to preserve. It was the head of the Roman state religion, the Pontifex Maximus, Nasica, who incited the mob to kill Tiberius, and his followers as well, and he did so with a cry that marks the epitome of misguided patriotism. Let those who would save our country follow me. The selections are from Plutarch's Life of Tiberius Gracchus, generally considered to favor the Reform Party. Then we'll talk about Gaius Gracchus and the Roman New Deal that was continued, and to an even greater degree than his older brother, Gaius Gracchus labored to bring government back to the people. He was elected tribune in 124 BCE, and until he failed to be re-elected for a third term, he consistently ignored the Senate in presenting his comprehensive program of legislation before the popular assembly. When the use of legitimate but quite unethical means of stopping him failed, the senatorial oligarchy contributed to the precedent of force, which it had already established in dealing with his elder brother, by forcing Gaius's death and decreeing death without trial for some 3,000 of his supporters. After this, there remained still little hope of solving Rome's problems by democratic and constitutional means. And although mixed with an amount of political opportunism, Gaius Gracchus's legislative programs was far more constructive and statesmanlike than the simple land law of his more visionary brother. Where Tiberius hoped to eliminate present problems in one fell swoop with the restoration of the old Roman agricultural society, Gaius realistically sought to solve each specific problem by remedial legislation fitted to the demands of the situation at hand. People will always debate the validity of much of Gaius Gracchus's major legislation, but few will doubt, after reading Plutarch's account of the constructive energy with which he faced Rome's problems, that he deserves the name of statesman. It should not be difficult to understand why the Roman people, as Plutarch had reported, looked with amazement at the man himself, seeing him attended by crowds of building contractors, artisans, ambassadors, magistrates, soldiers, and learned men, to all of whom he was of easy access. Then, of course, we have Gaius Gracchus. He talks about his legislative program, certain tactics of the Senate, and things of that nature. Now we will skip over and talk about Cicero before we mention Julius Caesar. As a matter of fact, I think I'm just going to go ahead and talk about Julius Caesar, and then give Cicero his own video. And so the man, Julius Caesar, and the statesman, Julius Caesar. Among the complex of problems that destroyed the Roman Republic, the immediate and most apparent one was the rise to supremacy of military leaders strong enough to defy constitution, senate, and assembly alike. The deep-seated and largely unsolved issues that had arisen during more than a century of Roman expansion were fundamentally due to the decline of the Republic, but it was on the sword of the victorious and supremely powerful general that the Republic committed suicide. The first triumvirate from 60 to 53 BCE was formed when three military leaders, that of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, relinquished their rivalry in order to control Rome in their own interests and in defiance of the constitution. And after the death of Crassus, however, the Senate, scheming to regain power, won over Pompey, with the intent of using him against Caesar and then destroying him altogether. But the results of the civil war that followed were not what the Senate had anticipated. Caesar emerged all-powerful and proceeded to manipulate the constitution in order to give himself absolute power for life. He was convinced that the events of the previous century had made the Republican Constitution unworkable, and that, in his own words, quote, "the Republic is nothing but a name, without substance or reality," end quote. And thus the question raised by Thucydides with regard to Athens, is a democracy capable of running an empire, was again answered in the negative. During the short period of his dictatorship from 46 to 44 BCE, Caesar brought order throughout the Roman world. His constructive program of legislation and his colorful personality are described in the selections from the lives of the Caesars by Suetonius from around AD 75 to 150. Alexis de Tocqueville's famous characterization in 1835 of Napoleon said that he was as great as a man can be without morality, and it is even more applicable to Caesar. The son of any army officer of the equestrian capitalist class, Suetonius held various imperial posts, including that of secretary to the Imperator Hadrian, before he retired to a life of study and writing. And of his voluminous writings, only the lives, the biographies of Julius Caesar and the first 11 imperators, Augustus to Domitian, has survived entirely, and indication of its early and continuing popularity. But it is also an outstanding source of information for the historian on the early empire, for despite Suetonius's uncritical fondness for gossip and scandal, he also frequently quotes contemporary documents and uses of other sources of great value to the historian. And so you have Caesar the man and Caesar the statesman. Concerning a little bit about the assassination of Julius Caesar. The assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March, or March 15th, in the year 44 BCE, turned out to be an act of great folly that removed the only man that was capable of maintaining order in the dying Roman Republic. The conspirators had no program and little understanding of the needs of the time, and the end result of their work was the renewal of anarchy and civil war. And while some of the 60 or more conspirators undoubtedly were motivated by a selfish interest, many were genuinely alarmed over Caesar's too open disregard of republican forms and traditions. To them it seemed a simple solution to commit what Cicero afterwards called a great and glorious deed, and in the name of libertas, rid Rome of a tyrant. But this was idealism gone blind, for what was restored was the libertas of the privileged senatorial few to exploit the inhabitants of the provinces, and the libertas of the shiftless Roman mob to sell itself to the highest bidder. The folly of the deed and the anarchy that was to follow were foreshadowed when, immediately after the murder, Brutus addressed the Senate with an oration on libertas, to which, as Plutarch recounts, no one paid any attention. Next, we will be reading from Cicero. Cicero, an advocate of property rights, Greek philosophy, and the status quo. He advocated two classes of men eager to engage in politics. He advocated the study of philosophy and no invasion of property rights by the state or the Senate. He was a champion of libertas, the second Philippic. And as you know, Cicero also wrote the laws.